Rain fell like a curtain, heavy and relentless, turning the quiet suburban street into a mirror of gray reflections. The streetlights shimmered through the downpour, casting long, fractured shadows across puddles that rippled with every passing car. Engines roared, tires splashed, and the world felt hurried and distant. But one figure moved slowly through the storm, a woman hunched beneath a tattered coat that did little to shield her from the cold. Her steps were tentative, dragging as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. She pressed her arms against her chest, shivering, and glanced toward the flickering light of a nearby house. Inside that house, James wiped his hands on a dish towel, the warm smell of dinner lingering faintly in the kitchen. His daughter's laughter floated up the stairs, a sound that always softened the edges of his tired evenings. James was a single dad, carrying more than his share of life's burdens. Late-night shifts, bills that seemed to multiply overnight, and the tender responsibility of raising a child alone. He looked out the window, drawn by a movement at the curb. There she was, the woman. Her eyes caught us through the rain, wide and wet, holding something he couldn't name at first. Fear, exhaustion, a silent plea. It was raw, immediate. His chest tightened. He grabbed an umbrella, the old one that had survived more storms than he cared to count, and ran toward her. "Hey!" he called, voice barely audible over the rain. She flinched, stepping back, wary. He could see it in her eyes, years of rejection, of people passing her by without a second thought. But he didn't hesitate. He held the umbrella over her, offering a small shield from the storm, a gesture that seemed almost too human for the harsh night. Her gaze lingered, searching him, measuring if he was real, if he was safe. "Do you want to come inside?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and together they stepped into the warm light of his home. The smell of cooked rice and broth greeted her, and for a moment, she simply froze, as if the concept of warmth and shelter was foreign. James moved quietly, setting a plate in front of her, trying not to overwhelm her. She sat, hands shaking, and as she ate, she began to speak. I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered. Her voice was soft, breaking. "Evicted. No family. No one. I don't know what to do." James listened, nodding, saying little, letting her words fill the silence. The kitchen clock ticked in the background, but it felt louder than ever. The rain continued to drum against the windows, relentless and unyielding. He watched her, noting the way her shoulders hunched, the tremor in her hands, the way she avoided his gaze as if it carried judgment. But he didn't judge. He simply waited, letting her story spill in fragments, raw and jagged, until she was spent. When the plate was empty, he poured her a cup of tea, the steam curling into the air, and handed it to her. She accepted it with a quiet nod, eyes finally lifting to meet his. In that instant, something shifted. Connection, understanding. Neither had to speak it aloud, but the bond formed there in that small, rain-soaked kitchen was real. Vulnerability had a voice, and tonight, they were listening. Later, he carried her coat to the bedroom where his daughter slept, tucking it into a chair, as if trying to preserve some semblance of dignity for the woman who had none to spare. James climbed the stairs, and when he entered his daughter's room, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes, holding her stuffed rabbit close. "Did she eat?" she asked quietly. He nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face, feeling a weight he didn't yet understand pressing at his chest. He kissed her forehead, her small hand lingering in his, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, the world was entirely unforgiving. Back downstairs, the woman sat quietly, sipping her tea, staring at the rain. James watched her, his mind racing. He had acted on instinct, on something deeper than logic, deeper than fear. Helping her was impulsive, dangerous, even. He knew that. He knew the world could turn against him for 1,000 reasons. But his heart had no hesitation. He had made a choice. A human choice. The night stretched on, the storm outside showing no signs of letting up. James found himself standing by the window, staring at the blurred shapes of cars passing through the sheets of rain. The woman's soft breathing from the living room behind him reminded him of the fragility of life, of the invisible struggles that so many carried in silence. She didn't belong in this home. Not really. And yet, There she was, safe, warm. For now, he thought about the weeks ahead, about bills, about the inevitable questions from neighbors, and about the uncertainty of what he had done. But none of that mattered. Not tonight. Tonight, he had made a difference. And sometimes that was enough. Outside, the rain continued its relentless rhythm, drumming a quiet warning. Life, James knew, had a way of repaying even the smallest acts of kindness. He didn't know how or when. Maybe it would come as gratitude. Maybe it would come as trouble. Maybe it would come in a form he couldn't yet imagine. But one thing was certain. His ordinary life, his carefully managed routine had just shifted. A ripple had begun in the water. And soon, the ripple would become a wave. The woman set her empty cup on the counter, her gaze lingering on James. He nodded once, faintly, silently. No words needed. There was trust in that nod. Respect. A quiet acknowledgement that tonight, the world had tilted, even if only a little, toward hope. And as James finally climbed the stairs to rest, he felt it in his bones. The night was far from over. The story had only just begun, and the echoes of this encounter would reach farther than he could possibly see. The rain continued to pour. Outside, the street remained empty, except for a few stray headlights passing through the mist. Inside, a single dad and a homeless woman sat in quiet understanding, each forever changed by the other. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside was only beginning. And when the first light of dawn hit the horizon, neither of them would be the same. One act of courage, one act of compassion, had set in motion a story that neither could have predicted, a story that would test their hearts, challenge their beliefs, and ultimately teach them both the meaning of humanity. And as James closed his eyes that night, listening to the faint rhythm of the rain against the window, he didn't know it yet, but in a few short weeks, the woman he had helped would knock on his door again, not for help, but to change everything. At first, life tried to pull James back into its ordinary rhythm, as if the storm of that night had never happened. The bills still piled up on the kitchen counter. The laundry waited in silent stacks, and his daughter's homework demanded his attention in ways that left him exhausted before the sun even set. He went through the motions, making breakfast, brushing teeth, tying shoelaces, checking homework. But the memory of Clara lingered, an invisible weight pressing at the edges of his mind. She had left quietly that first morning, stepping into the street with a small nod, eyes downcast. But she didn't disappear. Not really. She seemed to linger in subtle ways. A knock on the door, a shadow at the window, a soft voice calling for advice, guidance, food, a warm meal. Always polite, never demanding, but persistent. Neighbors began to notice. First, it was a glance, a whispered comment over the fence. "Who is that woman always coming and going?" someone asked, voice sharp with suspicion. Then more whispers arrived, spreading like wildfire. Landlords asked questions. Local shopkeepers observed. And before long, the whispers found their way to authorities. "Why is she here?" one official demanded, tilting his head, scanning the modest home with a mix of disbelief and judgment. James's chest tightened every time the question landed in his mind. He tried to explain, tried to convince himself that he had done nothing wrong. But the tension grew like ivy, wrapping around every aspect of his life. Inside his home, the atmosphere changed. Conversations with Clara became quieter, more deliberate. She was soft-spoken, graceful in her movements, but James could feel the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. Every gesture, every glance, carried an unspoken plea for normalcy, for acceptance. And yet, every day that she lingered, James felt the scrutiny of the outside world pressing closer. Late-night phone calls jolted him from sleep. Friends and neighbors hinted at judgment. "You don't have to take on the whole world," one said, eyes heavy with unspoken advice. And he didn't. He only wanted to help. But in a society quick to question, quick to judge, simple kindness became a liability. He found himself pacing the small living room at night, hands clenched at his sides. "I can't keep doing this alone," he muttered under his breath, the words tasting bitter and helpless on his tongue. The world didn't understand. They couldn't see the humanity in her, the dignity hidden beneath torn clothes and weary eyes. To them, she was a problem, a liability, someone who disrupted the fragile balance of polite suburbia. But James saw her differently. Every glance she gave, every quiet smile, carried gratitude so deep it rooted itself in his chest. He saw resilience. He saw courage. And he felt a responsibility that went beyond reason, beyond fear. The imbalance between them became impossible to ignore. He, with his modest apartment, steady paycheck, and daughter tucked safely into bed each night. She, carrying a past he could barely guess, walking a tightrope between despair and survival. He began to notice the small ways she tried to repay his kindness. She cleaned quietly after meals, left small notes of thanks tucked where he would find them, and sometimes she simply listened, offering a patient ear while he voiced frustrations he couldn't share anywhere else. The gestures were subtle, but they spoke volumes. James felt both comforted and unsettled. This connection, fragile and complicated, was becoming central to his life, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Rumors at the neighborhood store became more pointed. A glance too long in the checkout line. Questions from the postman. "Is that your friend?" someone would ask, voice laced with suspicion. James's shoulders tightened at every encounter. He tried to shrug it off, tried to focus on his work and his daughter, but the tension followed him everywhere. Even Clara, for all her quiet resilience, sensed it. Sometimes, she would pause at the door, hand on the frame, as if feeling the weight of eyes on them both. Their conversations, once free and easy, became cautious, deliberate. Words were measured. Silences lingered longer. Every movement carried meaning. Every stare question. One night, James found himself staring at the small window above the sink, watching the rain streak the glass in patterns that mirrored his own turmoil. He whispered to the empty room, "I'm not ready for this. I can't carry the world for someone else." But in the next breath, he thought of her face, the exhaustion in her eyes, the dignity she refused to surrender, even when the world treated her like nothing. And he knew, with a certainty that startled him, that he couldn't turn away. Not now, not ever. Her presence had become a test of his own courage, his own humanity. Days bled into weeks. The small acts of kindness he offered became routine, almost invisible to the outside world, yet monumental to Clara. She never asked for more than he could give. She never imposed herself. And yet, with every interaction, she silently reminded him of the imbalance that defined their relationship. He provided safety, food, guidance. She offered gratitude, dignity, and a quiet strength that anchored him in ways he hadn't known he needed. The tension outside, however, continued to mount. Calls from neighbors, questions from landlords, casual remarks from strangers, all pressing in, threatening to undo the fragile sanctuary they had created together. One evening, after another long day of work, James returned home to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up at him, eyes calm but alert. "I don't want to be a burden," she said softly, almost too quietly to hear. But he heard it. He always heard it. "You're not," he replied immediately, voice firm. "You're human. That's enough." And in that moment, the world outside, the whispers, the judgment, the tension, seemed to pause. For a brief, fleeting heartbeat, it was just the two of them, human, alive, connected. Yet, James couldn't shake the gnawing worry. What if the world caught up to them? What if his choices brought consequences he hadn't considered? The fear was tangible, wrapping itself around his chest every time the phone rang or a neighbor passed by. He had never wanted to attract attention. He had only wanted to do what felt right, and that rightness, that simple act of compassion, was now a delicate flame in a storm of scrutiny and doubt. He didn't know how long it could survive. Clara, sensing his unease, reached across the table, resting her hand lightly near his. It was a gesture that carried no demands, only reassurance. "I'll be okay," she said, voice steady. "Because of you." Her words, so simple, struck him harder than any argument or warning ever could. She wasn't just surviving. She was thriving, quietly, resiliently, in the space he had made for her. And he realized, with a pang he couldn't name, that he was not just helping her. She was teaching him, too, about patience, about courage, about seeing humanity where others saw none. The imbalance between them was undeniable, yet was no longer a source of shame or fear. It was a tension that tested him, forced him to confront his limits, his empathy, his willingness to stand for what was right in a world that often rewarded indifference. And though he didn't know it yet, this tension, the whispers, the stares, the late-night fears, was merely the prelude to a reckoning far greater than either of them could anticipate, because what had begun as small, private acts of kindness was now threading its way into the broader world, pulling on strands he couldn't yet see. Every glance Clara gave, every silent nod, every quiet word of gratitude was a reminder that generosity, even when unnoticed, has power. And in the weeks to come, that power would return to him in ways that would shake the very foundation of his ordinary life. For now, James watched her from across the table, the rain drumming against the window behind her, and realized the truth. Life would not be simple again. Compassion had a cost. Courage demanded patience. And yet, he would not turn away. Not now. Not ever. The tension, the scrutiny, the judgment, they were all part of the test, and he, willingly or not, was in the middle of it. Outside, the night deepened, silent except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Inside, a single dad and a woman who had lost everything shared a quiet moment of understanding, bracing for the storm that was coming, unaware of just how close it already was. And somewhere in the shadows of the neighborhood, whispers continued to spread, unaware that the smallest acts of kindness could stir the winds of fate in ways they could never imagine. The knock came sharp, hard, echoing through the small apartment like a warning. James froze mid-step, the dishes still damp his hands. The sound wasn't casual. It wasn't ordinary. It carried a weight, a seriousness that made the air itself feel heavy. Another rap, firm, insistent. He glanced at Clara. She had been quietly reading at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, her eyes lifted, calm, controlled, observant. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew fear when it slithered down his spine. The door swung open, and they stepped inside like soldiers of some corporate army. Lawyers. Their suits were sharp black, immaculately pressed. Papers clutched tightly in their hands. Folders that seemed to contain not just documents, but power itself. Authority. Judgment. Every movement precise, every glance measured. James's heart thumped loud in his chest. The quiet apartment suddenly felt too small, too fragile, too exposed. Clara rose from her chair. She moved with a confidence he had never seen before, shoulders squared, chin lifted. The timid, weary woman he had first met, shivering in the rain, seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone entirely different. "James," she said, her voice calm low, but carrying a weight that made him pause. "We need to talk." The lawyers placed the folders on the table. The papers snapped open, revealing numbers, contracts, legal motions, stakes that made his head swim. He stared at them, trying to understand, trying to grasp why this was happening. And then she spoke. "I didn't tell you everything," she said. Her eyes met his, steady and honest. "I've been preparing for a long time. Not just surviving. Planning. You see, I had a life before this. A career. Money. Status. It was taken from me. Stolen. And I've spent years figuring out how to reclaim it." James blinked, the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His mind couldn't catch up. This was impossible. The woman he had fed, sheltered, and trusted had been quietly plotting a return to a world he had never imagined. The room seemed to shrink around him. Fear and awe tangled together in his chest, twisting and tightening. He felt exposed, vulnerable, small. But then Clara smiled. Not the small, polite smile of gratitude. Not a timid nod, but a true, full smile. Gentle, human, grateful. And it struck him with a force he hadn't expected. "You didn't know," she said softly, almost a whisper. "And that's okay. But what you gave me, it was more than food, more than shelter, more than kindness. You gave me trust, dignity, something money could never buy." The words landed like a hammer, breaking walls he hadn't even realized were there. He felt tears prick at his eyes, but he swallowed them. Pride, disbelief, relief, confusion, all jumbled together in a messy, human cocktail he couldn't untangle. The lawyers shuffled papers, numbers, contracts, legal leverage that could change lives, redistribute power, settle old scores. But James barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Clara. She had been invisible, voiceless, powerless in the world's eyes. And yet, here she was, strong, commanding, prepared. The same woman who had sat quietly, waiting for a meal, was now wielding authority like a sword. And she wasn't angry. Not at him. Not at the world. She was grateful. James's hand shook, resting on the edge of the counter. I don't understand, he said, voice raw. You all this time, I thought. His words faltered. How could he have known? How could he have guessed? He had only seen a woman in need. A woman cold, hungry, frightened. He had only acted out of instinct, out of heart. And yet, that simple act, invisible to the world, had set into motion a chain of events he could never have imagined. Clara leaned forward slightly. You think this is about me reclaiming something I lost, she said. It's not. It's about showing that even the smallest kindness, what others see as weak or foolish, can have power. Real power. You know it, James, but you gave me a foundation to stand on. A reason to rise again. The words hit him in a way that made him swallow hard. She wasn't boasting. She was teaching. She was revealing a truth too many overlooked. Generosity has unseen consequences, ripples that can shift worlds. The lawyers cleared their throats, a reminder that business waited, that contracts, finances, and legality demanded attention. But James barely heard them. His mind replayed their first encounter. The rain, the cold, the quiet desperation in her eyes. He remembered lifting the umbrella, offering warmth, offering trust. And now, she had returned it, not as repayment in kind, but as transformation. She had become a force, a reminder that the world could be reshaped by courage, empathy, and quiet faith. He finally spoke, voice low, almost reverent. I just wanted to help. Clara's smile widened, softening. Human again. And you did. More than you know. You gave me what everyone else overlooked. You treated me like a person. You saw me. That is priceless. The room shifted again, subtly, not in walls or furniture, but in energy. The balance of power, once so clear, had changed. The underdog had risen. The quiet woman had become a presence that could not be ignored. James sank into a chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked around the small apartment at the mundane things that had once seemed ordinary. Dishes stacked in the sink, a child's drawing on the fridge, the single lamp casting warm light, and felt a profound shift. His life, his understanding of kindness, of power, of human dignity, had changed. The world outside, with its rules, its judgments, its petty hierarchies, felt subtly different. He had acted with heart, and now heart had acted back, in ways both shocking and beautiful. Clara folded her hands, the lawyer standing at attention, waiting for her cue. She had turned vulnerability into strength, fear into leverage, silence into influence. And James realized something he had never fully understood before. The act that seems small, the choices that feel invisible, are the ones that shape destiny. Not fame, not money, not power wielded for its own sake. Kindness, trust, respect. They carry weight that no ledger or legal document can measure. The papers on the table were still heavy, the numbers still daunting. But James's perspective had shifted. He saw beyond the legalities, beyond the material consequences, into the core of the lesson Clara was teaching him. The world could take and it could judge and it could punish, but it could never undo humanity when it was offered freely, without expectation, without calculation. And Clara, standing there, calm and composed, was living proof. The knock at the door, once a warning, had become the opening to revelation. The storm, once threatening, had delivered clarity. The quiet woman who had entered his life with nothing but desperation had now returned as a symbol of resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of unseen acts. James felt awe, respect, and humility swell inside him. Fear was still there, lurking. Confusion, too. But they were tempered by a recognition he couldn't ignore. Generosity doesn't go unnoticed. It doesn't disappear. It transforms. It demands recognition, sometimes in ways the giver never anticipates. Clara's gaze met his once more. "Thank you," she said simply, soft, almost shyly, yet carrying the weight of everything unsaid. And in that single moment, James understood the truth. The measure of life is not in what you accumulate or control or command. It is in what you give freely, what you risk, and how you honor the humanity in others. The lawyers began to speak, the words formal and precise, but James barely heard them. He was watching Clara, seeing her rise, realizing that he had been part of something far greater than his own understanding. The apartment, the neighborhood, the small routines of his life. Everything had shifted, changed, because he had made one choice, one act of compassion in a cold, indifferent world. And now, that choice had returned, transformed in ways that were both humbling and profound. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening in that small apartment. James realized, with a deep and settling certainty, that life is a way of rewarding courage. Even when the courage seems insignificant, that acts of kindness, unseen and unheralded, ripple outward in ways no one can predict. And when they return, they often arrive in forms that shock, inspire, and teach lessons far greater than one could imagine. Clara smiled once more, the faintest glimmer of triumph in her eyes, and James understood the weight of her words. He had given trust. She had returned dignity. And in that exchange, they had both been transformed. The power dynamics had shifted. The world, invisible and visible, had been reminded that true strength often lies not in wealth or status or authority, but in the simple act of seeing another person as fully human. And as James exhaled, letting the tension of weeks settle like dust in a quiet room, he knew that his life had changed forever. The quiet, ordinary man, the single dad juggling bills and bedtime stories, had witnessed the extraordinary. He had given, unknowingly, the seed that had grown into a storm of revelation, of justice, of redemption. And the lesson, clear as the dawn yet still unfolding, was this: when we act with heart, the world cannot help but respond. The morning sun cut through the blinds, casting sharp lines across the small apartment that had witnessed so much in so little time. James stood by the window, hands in his pockets, trying to steady his breathing. The air felt heavy with expectation, electric with the tension of the unknown. He had already faced storms, rain-slicked streets, whispers from neighbors, the unrelenting pressure of life. But nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. Clara's lawyers had arrived again. This time, the air was different. Calm, measured, serious, but not hostile. There was no threat in their steps, no judgment in their eyes, only possibility. James's daughter peeked from the bedroom doorway, hair tousled, eyes wide with curiosity. He offered her a small smile, one that didn't reach the tension in his shoulders. "Stay here," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he truly believed it. The room felt smaller than ever, stacked with the weight of what was coming. Clara stepped in, her presence commanding without arrogance. She carried herself with a confidence that had been invisible before, but now it radiated like sunlight through storm clouds. She approached James, her gaze steady, unwavering, and for the first time, he noticed a glimmer of triumph beneath her calm exterior. The lawyers moved forward, opening folders, their precise movements echoing in the room. James's heart raced, every breath shallow. He expected confrontation, legal threats, questions, anger. But there was none of that. Instead, Clara spoke first, her voice soft and firm, carrying authority he had never imagined she could wield. "James," she said, "we're not here to take. We're here to offer. Not a lawsuit, not a claim, but an opportunity." The words hit him like a wave. His brow furrowed, confusion and disbelief mingling in his chest. "An opportunity?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," she said, sitting across from him, her hands folded neatly. "I want to rebuild what I lost. And I want you to be part of it, not as charity, not as a favor, as a partner." The weight of her words settled slowly, like a tide rising in his chest. He blinked, unable to speak, unable to grasp the full reality. She continued, outlining her vision, her plan, the legal framework, the steps forward. It wasn't just business. It was trust, carefully structured, a bridge between her past and the present, a way for James and his daughter to step into security without surrendering dignity. As she spoke, James realized the true depth of the transformation. This was not just financial, not just a repayment of kindness or effort. It was recognition, validation, a reclaiming of agency for both of them. He had offered food, warmth, and trust in the midst of her despair, expecting nothing. And now, she returned it in a way that honored both of them, elevating them beyond fear, beyond struggle, beyond judgment. It was a reminder that human connection, compassion, and courage could shape futures in ways that no wealth or status alone could command. Clara paused, letting her words sink in. James could see the sincerity in her eyes, the reflection of their shared journey. Fear, vulnerability, struggle, and quiet perseverance. She had risen from invisibility to influence, from despair to agency, and he had been part of that ascent, not as a hero, but as a witness, a catalyst. And in that, he understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't in the numbers, the contracts, the folders the lawyers carried. Power was in courage, in generosity, in the willingness to see another human being fully and respond with dignity. He swallowed hard, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. The apartment felt different now, transformed by possibility, by hope, by the tangible sense that lives could change without warning. Clara's lawyers detailed the plan carefully, but James hardly noticed the technicalities. His mind was elsewhere, on the woman who had arrived at his doorstep shivering, the quiet moments of trust, the long nights of silence and conversation. He remembered the first meal he had offered her, the small gestures that had felt so insignificant at the time, and now they had become the foundation for something extraordinary. Clara looked at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You see," she said softly, "even the smallest act of kindness can ripple farther than we imagine. What you did for me, it set everything in motion, and now we can move forward together." James's eyes brimmed with emotion. He wanted to speak, to say something profound, but no word seemed adequate. Instead, he nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her meaning. The room felt alive, charged with potential, as if every choice, every act of generosity, had finally been acknowledged by the world itself. He glanced at his daughter, who had crept closer, watching quietly from the doorway. Her presence reminded him of why he had acted in the first place. Compassion wasn't about reward. It was about courage, about making the choice to see humanity in someone who had been overlooked, disregarded, dismissed. And now, through Clara, through her strength and resilience, he understood that courage and compassion were not weaknesses. They were the most profound forms of power anyone could wield. The lawyers began to speak again, outlining the next steps, the logistics, the legal details. James listened, but his mind wandered to the bigger picture. The wealth, the status, the conventional markers of success. They had little meaning compared to this moment. The unseen human connections, the quiet acts of trust and respect, had changed everything. The roles had shifted. The wealthy, the powerless, the marginalized. They were no longer confined by society's expectations. Empathy had leveled the playing field in ways no one else could see. Clara rose, signaling the meeting's conclusion. She moved toward the door, pausing before she stepped out. Her eyes met James's, shimmering, alive with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. No ceremony, no grand gesture, just gratitude, just recognition. The room seemed to hold its breath as she opened the door and stepped into the world beyond. And James understood, fully and completely, that what had begun as an act of compassion had transformed into something far greater. Not just security, not just partnership, but understanding, humanity, and the affirmation of dignity. The apartment felt quiet now, peaceful in a way it hadn't before. James sank into a chair, exhaling slowly, letting the tension slip from his chest. The lesson was clear. Life was not fair. It never had been, and perhaps it never would be. But kindness, humility, courage, and heart, those could tip the scales in ways wealth, status, or power never could. He had witnessed it, felt it, and now it was part of him, ingrained in every choice he would make moving forward. He looked out the window, seeing the city alive with movement, Unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken place inside his small home, people walked past, absorbed in their routines, unaware that a single act of generosity could change the trajectory of a life, and in turn, shift the course of someone else's. He thought about Clara, about the ripple she had created by reclaiming her strength and using to honor their connection. It was a profound reminder that dignity, trust, and human connection were more powerful than fear, more enduring than money, and more transformative than any legal victory. James finally turned back to his daughter, who had climbed onto the couch beside him, small hands slipping into his. "Do you see?" he whispered, though she was too young to fully understand. "Even small kindness, it matters, more than we know." She nodded sleepily, resting her head against his shoulder. And in that moment, James felt a clarity he had never known before. Life's unfairness was real, but generosity, empathy, and courage, they had the power to rewrite outcomes, to shift perspectives, to create opportunities where none seemed possible. The day continued, ordinary in its surface, extraordinary beneath. James knew that life would challenge him again, that struggle would return. But he also knew that the choices he made, how he treated people, how he extended trust, how he honored dignity, would continue to ripple outward in ways he could never fully predict. Claire's return had been proof. The world could be harsh, cruel, and indifferent, but it could also be moved, reshaped, and redeemed by the simplest human acts. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the apartment, James felt a quiet resolve settle in him. He had witnessed transformation. He had seen courage and compassion in action. He had learned, deeply, that true power was not in what one had, but in what one gave. And as he watched the first evening lights flicker on in the streets below, he understood this truth with unshakable certainty. In a world hungry for selfishness, courage and compassion were the greatest power anyone could wield.